The pilots of the Ethiopian Airlines 737 MAX that crashed last month appear to have followed the emergency procedure laid out by both Boeing and the Federal Aviation Authority, FAA, cutting off the suspect flight control system, but could not regain control and avert the fatal plunge that killed all 157 on board. The Wall Street Journal, citing people briefed on the crash investigation's preliminary findings, reported Tuesday night that the pilots hit the system cutoff switches as Boeing had instructed after October's Lion Air MAX crash, but couldn't get the plane's nose back up. They then turned the system back on before the plane nosedived into the ground. A local expert, former Boeing flight control engineer Peter Lemmy, recently predicted this could happen. His account of how Boeing's emergency procedure could have failed disastrously is backed up by extracts from a 1982 Boeing 737-200 pilot training manual posted to an online pilot forum a month ago by an Australian pilot. If the preliminary investigation confirms that the Ethiopian pilots did cut off the automatic flight control system, this is a nightmarish outcome for Boeing and the FAA. It would suggest the emergency procedure that Boeing laid out for pilots worldwide after the Lion Air crash, that the FAA alerted airlines to the next day, is wholly inadequate, missing vital extra information that was in Boeing pilot manuals nearly 40 years ago but isn't any longer. That old 737 pilot manual lays out a scenario where a much more elaborate pilot response is required than the one Boeing outlined last November and has reiterated ever since. Just a week after the October 29 Lion Air crash, Boeing sent out an urgent bulletin to all 737 MAX operators across the world cautioning them that a sensor failure could cause a new MAX flight control system to automatically swivel upward the horizontal tail, also called the stabilizer, so pushing the jet's nose down. Boeing's bulletin laid out a seemingly simple response: hit a pair of cutoff switches to turn off that automatic system, known as the Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System, or MCAS, and then swivel the tail down by manually turning a large stabilizer trimmed wheel located next to the pilot's seat that connects mechanically to the tail via cables. Boeing has publicly contended for 5 months that this simple procedure was all that was needed to save the airplane if MCAS was inadvertently activated. In a November television interview on the Fox Business Network, Boeing chief executive Dennis Muilenburg, when asked about whether information had been withheld from pilots, cited the procedure as part of the training manual, and said Boeing's bulletin to airlines pointed to that existing flight procedure. But Lemmy said the Ethiopian pilots most likely were unable to carry out that last instruction in the Boeing emergency procedure, because they simply couldn't physically move that wheel against the heavy forces acting on the tail. The forces on the tail could have been too great, said Lemmy. They couldn't turn the manual trimmed wheel. The stabilizer in the Ethiopian jet could have been in an extreme position with two separate forces acting on it. MCAS had swiveled the stabilizer upward by turning a large mechanical screw inside the tail called the jack screw. This is pushing the jet's nose down. But the pilot had pulled his control column far back in an attempt to counter, which would flip up a separate movable surface called the elevator on the trailing edge of the tail. The elevator and stabilizer normally work together to minimize the loads on the jack screw. But in certain conditions, the elevator and stabilizer loads combine to present high forces on the jack screw and make turning it manually very difficult. In this scenario, the airflow pushing downward against the elevator would have created an equal and opposite load on the jack screw, a force tending to hold the stabilizer in its upward displacement. This heavy force would resist the pilot's manual effort to swivel the stabilizer back down. This analysis suggests the stabilizer trimmed wheel at the Ethiopian captain's right hand could have been difficult to budge. As a result, the pilots would have struggled to get the nose up and the plane to climb. If after much physical exertion failed, the pilots gave up their manual strategy and switched the electric trim system back on, MCAS would have begun pushing the nose down again. More detailed instructions that conceivably could have saved the plane in this situation are provided in the 1982 pilot manual for the old 737. As described in the extract posted by the Australian pilot, they require the pilot to do something counterintuitive, to let go of the control column for a brief moment. As Lemmy explains, this will make the nose drop a bit, but it will relax the force on the elevator and on the jack screw, allowing the pilot to crank the stabilizer trim wheel. The instructions in the old manual say that the pilot should repeatedly do this. Release the control column, uncrank the stabilizer wheel, release and crank, until the stabilizer is swiveled back to where it should be. The 1982 manual refers to this as the roller coaster technique, to trim the airplane, which means to get it back on the required flight path with no force pushing it away from that path. Nose up trim is required. Raise the nose well above the horizon with elevator control. Then slowly relax the control column pressure and manually trim nose up. Allow the nose to drop below the horizon while trimming, manually. Repeat the sequence until the airplane is trimmed, the manual states. The Australian pilot also posted an extract from Boeing's Airliner magazine published in May 1961, describing the similar technique as applied to Boeing's first jet, the 707. Clearly, this unusual circumstance of having to move the stabilizer manually while maintaining a high stick force on the control column demands significant piloting skill. We learned all about these maneuvers in the 1950s to 60s, the pilot wrote on the online forum. Yet, for some inexplicable reason, Boeing manuals have since deleted what was then, and still is, vital handling information for flight crews. The preliminary investigation report into the Ethiopian crash is expected soon and will offer more detail on exactly what happened in the cockpit.